concert hall in Vienna glowed with golden light as hundreds of elegantly dressed guests filled the ornate seats. Crystal chandeliers hung from the Baroque ceiling, casting shimmering reflections across the polished marble floors. Tonight was supposed to be magical. The renowned International Music Foundation was hosting its annual gala, and the guest of honor was none other than Victor Albrecht, one of the most celebrated pianists in the world. His fingers had graced the keys of every major concert hall from Carnegie to the Sydney Opera House. Critics called him a genius, audiences called him untouchable. And tonight he would perform for Vienna's elite, the same city where Mozart and Beethoven once walked. Among the crowd sat Alina Kovac, a 38-year-old woman who felt completely out of place. She wore a simple black dress that she had borrowed from her sister, and her hands fidgeted nervously with the program in her lap. Alina worked as a hospital administrator, managing schedules and paperwork for the cardiology department. Her days were filled with phone calls, insurance forms, and making sure doctors had what they needed. Music was not her world. She had never attended a classical concert before tonight. The only reason she was here at all was because her friend Martina, who worked in event planning, had an extra ticket at the last minute and insisted Alina join her. Martina leaned over and whispered excitedly about how lucky they were to see Victor Albrecht perform live. She explained that tickets had sold out within hours and that people had traveled from across Europe just for this evening. Alina nodded politely, trying to absorb the grandeur around her. But she felt like an intruder in a world that belonged to people who understood the difference between concertos and sonatas. She had learned to play a little piano as a child, just basic lessons that her grandmother had given her in their small apartment. Her grandmother had been a music teacher decades ago, before the war, before everything changed. Those lessons had stopped when Alina was 12, after her grandmother passed away. The old upright piano stayed in the family apartment for years until they finally sold it to make room for other things. Victor Albrecht appeared on stage to thunderous applause. He was tall and lean, dressed in an immaculate black tuxedo. His silver hair was swept back perfectly, and his expression carried the confidence of someone who had conquered every stage he had ever stood upon. He acknowledged the audience with a slight bow, his movements precise and controlled. Everything about him seemed calculated for effect. He sat at the grand piano, adjusted his position slightly, and then paused for dramatic effect before placing his hands on the keys. The first notes filled the hall with such power and clarity that Alina felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She had never heard anything like it in person. The music seemed to travel through the air and settle directly into her chest. For the next hour, Victor performed pieces by Chopin, Liszt, and Rachmaninoff. His fingers moved across the keys with impossible speed and precision. The audience sat in reverent silence, captivated by every note. When he finished, the applause was deafening. People rose to their feet, shouting bravos and clapping until their hands hurt. Victor stood and bowed multiple times, soaking in the adoration. After his final bow, he stepped to the front of the stage and raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "Thank you, Vienna," he said in German, his voice smooth and practiced. "You have always been so generous to me. Tonight, I want to do something different, something spontaneous." He smiled, and the audience leaned forward with anticipation. "I would like to invite someone from the audience to come and play with me, just one piece. Anyone who feels brave enough to share this stage." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Several hands shot up immediately, mostly young music students who dreamed of such an opportunity. Victor scanned the audience slowly, his eyes moving from section to section. Then, unexpectedly, his gaze stopped on Alina. She felt her stomach drop. She was not raising her hand, she was not even looking at him directly. She had been glancing at her program, wondering how much longer the evening would last. "You," Victor said, pointing directly at her. "The woman in the black dress, 5th row, yes, you, would you come up and play something for us?" Alina's face went pale. Martina gasped beside her and grabbed her arm. "He's pointing at you. Oh my God, Alina, he wants you to play." Alina shook her head quickly. No, I can't, I don't play. I mean, I used to, but not really. This is a mistake." But Victor was already gesturing for her to come forward, and the audience had turned to look at her. A spotlight swung over and illuminated her seat. Hundreds of eyes focused on her face. She felt her throat tighten. The applause began again, this time encouraging her to stand. Martina was pushing her gently. "Just go, what an opportunity, you have to." Alina stood on shaking legs, her mind screaming at her to sit back down, but her body was already moving toward the aisle. The walk to the stage felt like it took forever. Her shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing in her ears. When she reached the stairs at the side of the stage, a staff member offered his hand to help her up. She climbed carefully, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Victor stood waiting with an amused smile on his face. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. His eyes held a glint of something she could not quite read. Confidence, certainly, but also something else, a kind of playful cruelty. "What is your name?" he asked, holding the microphone toward her. "Alina," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "Alina," he repeated as if testing the name. "And do you play piano, Alina?" "I did a long time ago, just a little. My grandmother taught me when I was young." "Oh, wonderful," Victor said, though his tone suggested he did not believe she could play anything of value. "Then you will play something for us tonight. Choose anything you like, perhaps chopsticks or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star." The audience laughed. It was a gentle laugh, but Alina felt the sting of it. He was making fun of her. This was not a genuine invitation. He had chosen someone who clearly did not belong on this stage so that he could entertain the audience with the contrast. She was the joke. Alina looked at the piano, its black surface gleaming under the stage lights. She thought about walking off, about returning to her seat and disappearing into the crowd. But then she thought about her grandmother. The woman who had survived a war, who had lost everything, and who had still found time to teach a little girl how to find beauty in music. Her grandmother had told her once that music was not about perfection. It was about truth. It was about saying something real when words were not enough. Alina walked slowly to the piano bench and sat down. Her hands were trembling. She placed them on the keys and felt their cool smoothness beneath her fingers. The audience was completely silent now, waiting. Victor stood a few feet away, arms crossed, that same amused smile on his face. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The piece Alina chose was one her grandmother had taught her during their last summer together. It was a simple melody, a folk song from the old country that had been arranged for piano generations ago. Her grandmother had played it at her own mother's funeral, and then again years later when she knew her time was coming. Alina had not touched a piano in over 20 years, but her fingers seemed to remember the patterns, as if they had been waiting patiently all this time for permission to move again. The first notes came out hesitant and soft. Her fingers stumbled slightly on the third measure, and she heard someone in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seat. Victor's smile widened. He had expected this. He had chosen her precisely because she would struggle, because the contrast between his mastery and her amateur attempt would highlight his greatness even further. The audience would laugh politely, she would hurry off stage embarrassed, and the evening would continue with everyone feeling grateful for true talent. But then something shifted. Alina stopped thinking about the audience. She stopped thinking about Victor standing there with his arms crossed. She stopped thinking about the fact that she was sitting on a stage in Vienna in front of hundreds of people who knew more about music than she ever would. Instead, she thought about her grandmother's small apartment with the afternoon sunlight coming through the lace curtains. She thought about the smell of tea brewing on the stove and the way her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, had guided her own small fingers across the keys. She thought about the stories her grandmother had told her about the old country, about villages that no longer existed, about songs that had been passed down through generations of people who had nothing left but their voices and their memories. Alina's playing became steadier. The hesitation disappeared. Her fingers found their rhythm, and the simple melody began to fill the concert hall with a different kind of beauty than what Victor had produced. Where his playing had been technically perfect and powerful, hers was raw and deeply human. The folk song was not grand or complex. It did not require impossible speed or virtuosic technique, but it carried something else. It carried longing, it carried loss. It carried the weight of lives lived in hardship and the stubborn insistence on finding joy anyway. The audience stopped shifting in their seats. The polite expectation of failure transformed into something else. People leaned forward, listening intently. In the fifth row, an elderly man with white hair felt tears forming in his eyes, though he could not say exactly why. Beside him, his wife reached for his hand. They had been married for 52 years, and suddenly she was remembering their wedding day, the small ceremony with just family, the way he had looked at her when she walked down the aisle in her mother's altered dress. Alina continued playing, moving into the second part of the piece where the melody descended into a minor key. Her grandmother had told her this section represented winter, when food was scarce and the cold seemed to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. But even in winter, people gathered around fires and told stories. Even in winter, children found ways to play. The music reflected this duality, sadness and resilience woven together in simple phrases that repeated and transformed. Victor's smile had faded. He uncrossed his arms and took a step closer, his head tilting slightly as he listened. This was not what he had expected. The woman was not a trained pianist, that much was obvious. Her technique was basic, her posture was wrong, and she hit a wrong note in the 13th measure. But none of that seemed to matter. She was communicating something that transcended technical perfection. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every note, and Victor felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. It was discomfort, yes, but also something deeper. When was the last time he had played music that made him feel something beyond pride in his own skill? Alina reached the final section of the piece, where the melody returned to the major key but played more softly, like a memory that was beginning to fade. Her grandmother had called this part the homecoming, though she never explained whether it meant returning to a physical place or simply finding peace. Alina's fingers moved gently across the keys, each note clear and deliberate. She was not performing anymore. She was simply remembering, and she was allowing everyone in the hall to remember with her. When the final note faded into silence, Alina kept her hands on the keys for a moment longer. She was back in her grandmother's apartment, and she was 12 years old again, and the old woman was smiling at her with such love and pride that it made her chest ache. Then she lifted her hands and folded them in her lap. She turned slightly to look at the audience, suddenly remembering where she was and what she had just done. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She had played a simple folk song on one of the world's most prestigious stages in front of Vienna's elite after the great Victor Albrecht had just performed Rachmaninoff. What must they think of her? For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched out and Alina felt panic rising in her throat. She had made a fool of herself. She should never have come up here. She started to stand, ready to hurry off the stage and out of the building, but then someone began to clap. It was the elderly man in the fifth row, the one with white hair and tears in his eyes. His applause started slowly but grew stronger. Then his wife joined him, then the woman sitting behind them. Then the entire section. Within seconds, the entire concert hall erupted in applause that was somehow different from the ovation they had given Victor earlier. This applause felt personal, as if each person was thanking Alina for reminding them of something they had forgotten. People stood from their seats. Several women were wiping their eyes. A young music student in the balcony found herself clapping so hard her palms stung. Though she could not articulate why this simple piece had affected her so deeply, when the technical brilliance she had just witnessed had merely impressed her. An elderly woman near the back of the hall was remembering her own grandmother, who had died 40 years ago. And suddenly she could hear the woman's voice again, singing while hanging laundry in a courtyard that had been demolished decades ago. Alina stood frozen at the piano, overwhelmed by the response. This could not be real. She had played a simple song with basic technique. She had made mistakes. Yet the audience was giving her a standing ovation that seemed to come from somewhere genuine and unguarded. She looked over at Victor, expecting to see anger or contempt, but instead she saw something complicated on his face. He was still clapping with the others, but his expression was distant, almost troubled, as if he was working through a difficult problem in his mind. Martina was on her feet in the audience, tears streaming down her face, clapping until her hands hurt. She had known Alina for 8 years, had worked alongside her, had shared countless coffee breaks discussing mundane office problems, and she had never known this existed inside her quiet friend. The woman who worried about hospital schedules and insurance paperwork had just moved hundreds of people to tears with a simple folk song. How was that possible? Alina finally managed to move. She bowed awkwardly, not sure what else to do, and then walked quickly toward the stage stairs. A staff member helped her down, and she hurried back to her seat while the applause continued. She sat down next to Martina, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and confusion. Martina grabbed her hand and squeezed it hard, unable to speak through her tears. Around them, people were still clapping, still standing, and Alina buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. On the stage, Victor stood alone beside his grand piano. He was still applauding mechanically, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about how many years he had spent perfecting his technique, memorizing the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, winning competitions, and earning the admiration of critics worldwide. He had dedicated his entire life to the piano. And yet this ordinary woman, this hospital administrator who had not played seriously in 2 decades, had just done something he could not remember doing in years. She had made people feel something real. The gala ended an hour later, but people lingered in the marble hallways of the concert hall, unable to stop talking about what they had witnessed. Small groups clustered together, replaying the moment when that ordinary woman had sat at the piano and somehow moved an entire audience to tears with a simple folk melody. Several people had recorded the performance on their phones, despite the usual prohibition against such things. By the time Alina and Martina left the building and stepped into the cool Vienna night, the first videos were already being uploaded to social media. Alina said very little on the taxi ride home. Martina kept squeezing her hand and saying things like "that was incredible" and "I cannot believe what just happened." But Alina felt numb and disconnected, as if the entire evening had happened to someone else. When the taxi dropped her at her apartment building, she climbed the 3 flights of stairs slowly, let herself in, and sat on her couch in the dark for a long time without turning on any lights. Her hands were still trembling slightly. She kept replaying Victor's mocking smile, the way he had asked if she knew chopsticks, the moment when she realized he had called her up as a joke. But then she remembered the feeling of her fingers on the keys, the way her grandmother's melody had come back to her after so many years, and the sound of that applause that felt so different from anything she had experienced before. She finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, but sleep would not come. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had imagined the entire thing. Maybe the audience had just been polite. Maybe they clapped because they felt sorry for her. Maybe by tomorrow everyone would forget it ever happened. She was wrong. By morning, Alina's performance had gone viral. The videos captured from different angles in the audience had been shared thousands of times. Music blogs picked up the story with headlines like "Unknown Woman Stuns Vienna Concert Hall" and "Simple Folk Song Brings Audience to Tears After Famous Pianist Performance." Classical music forums exploded with debates about technique versus emotion, about what it meant to truly play music, about whether Victor Albrecht had been humiliated or enlightened. By noon, major news outlets were running the story. By evening, it had spread across Europe and jumped to international media. Alina knew nothing about any of this until she arrived at work on Monday morning. She had spent the weekend quietly at home, reading a book and doing laundry, trying to process what had happened. When she walked into the hospital administration office, her coworkers erupted in excited chatter. "Alina, you are famous. Have you seen the videos? Everyone is talking about you." Her supervisor pulled her aside, slightly annoyed that Alina had not mentioned she was some kind of musical sensation, and now the hospital phones were ringing with journalists trying to reach her. Alina felt sick to her stomach. She had not wanted any of this. She was not a performer. She was not interesting. She just wanted to do her job and live her quiet life. But the journalists were relentless. They tracked down her phone number, her email, even her address. They wanted interviews, they wanted her story, they wanted to know everything about her grandmother and the folk song and what she had been thinking on that stage. Most of them seemed kind enough, but their attention felt suffocating. Alina declined every request, which only made them more interested. The mysterious woman who moved Vienna and then disappeared back into ordinary life became an even better story. Meanwhile, Victor Albrecht was having his own reckoning with what had happened that night. He had left the concert hall immediately after the performance ended, skipping the reception where he was supposed to meet donors and sign programs. His driver took him back to his hotel, and Victor went straight to his suite without speaking to anyone. He poured himself a glass of expensive scotch and sat by the window overlooking the city, trying to understand the strange hollow feeling in his chest. He had performed brilliantly that night. He knew he had. His technique had been flawless, his interpretation of the Rachmaninoff had been exactly what he intended, and the audience had given him a standing ovation. He should have felt satisfied, validated, successful. Instead, he felt empty. And that woman, that hospital administrator with her simple folk song and her amateur technique, had somehow achieved something he could not remember achieving in years. She had made people feel something real and unguarded. She had connected with them in a way that his perfection never did. Victor spent the next week in a haze of confusion and growing anger, though he was not sure who he was angry at. His manager called repeatedly about upcoming performances. He had concerts scheduled in London, Paris, and Berlin over the next month. But Victor found himself canceling them one by one, claiming illness, though he felt physically fine. What he could not explain to his manager or anyone else was that he could not bring himself to sit at a piano. Every time he approached the instrument, he thought about that night in Vienna and felt a wave of something that might have been shame or might have been grief for something he had lost without noticing. By the end of the second week, Victor's manager was furious. Canceling concerts meant breach of contract, financial penalties, and damaged relationships with concert halls and promoters. Victor's reputation for reliability was one of his greatest professional assets, and now he was throwing it away for reasons he refused to explain. The classical music world buzzed with speculation. Some said he was having a breakdown. Others whispered about substance abuse or scandal. A few astute observers connected his sudden retreat to the viral video from Vienna, but most dismissed that as ridiculous. Why would the great Victor Albrecht care about some amateur playing a folk song? Victor retreated to his estate on the shores of a remote lake in the Austrian countryside. He had bought the property years ago as an investment and occasional retreat, but he rarely spent time there. Now he needed isolation. The house was modern and minimalist, all glass and clean lines, with a music room that overlooked the water. The view was supposed to be inspiring, but Victor found himself avoiding that room entirely. Instead, he spent his days walking along the lake shore, reading books he had been meaning to get to for years, and trying not to think about pianos or concerts or the way that woman's simple melody had somehow broken something open inside him. 3 weeks after the Vienna concert, late at night when he could not sleep, Victor finally watched the video. Someone had compiled all the different phone recordings into one edited version that captured Alina's performance from multiple angles. Victor sat in the dark living room with his laptop and pressed play. He watched himself standing on stage with that smug smile, making his little joke about chopsticks. He watched Alina's face flush with embarrassment and confusion. He watched her sit at the piano with trembling hands. And then he watched her play. Victor played the video 3 times in a row. He was trying to analyze what she had done, trying to break it down technically so he could understand and replicate it. But that was the problem, he slowly realized. What Alina had done could not be analyzed or replicated through technique. She had not been performing, she had been remembering. She had been sharing something personal and true, and the audience had recognized that truth and responded to it. When was the last time Victor had played anything personal? When was the last time he had shared rather than displayed? He got up and walked to the music room. The grand piano sat there in the moonlight coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Victor sat on the bench and placed his hands on the keys. He tried to play the opening of the Chopin Nocturne he had performed thousands of times. His fingers moved through the familiar patterns, executing every note perfectly, but it sounded mechanical and dead. He stopped abruptly, his hands hovering over the keys. He thought about his childhood, about learning piano in his mother's small apartment, about the way she would sing while cooking dinner. He tried to remember the last time he had played just for himself, just because the music meant something to him beyond career advancement and critical acclaim. Victor could not remember. Somewhere along the way, through conservatory training and international competitions, and building his reputation as one of the finest pianists of his generation, he had lost whatever had made him love music in the first place. He had become a technician, a performer, a brand. But he was no longer a musician in the way that mattered. That ordinary woman in her borrowed black dress had reminded an entire concert hall what music was supposed to do, and Victor, for all his training and talent and success, had forgotten. All his training and talent and success had forgotten. The days at the lake house stretched into weeks, and Victor found himself sinking deeper into a crisis that he could not articulate to anyone. His manager called less frequently now, the angry phone calls replaced by terse emails outlining the financial and professional damage of his continued absence. Concert halls were threatening lawsuits, promoters were furious. His reputation, built carefully over 3 decades, was crumbling. Victor read these emails with distant detachment, as if they were describing someone else's problems. He started going through old boxes in the estate's storage room, something he had never bothered to do before. Most contained business files and contracts, but one box held family photographs that his mother had given him years ago, shortly before she died. Victor had never looked through them properly. Now he spread them across the living room floor and studied them in the afternoon light. There he was at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting at his mother's old upright piano. There was his mother standing behind him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Victor stared at that photo for a long time. He could not remember the last time he had smiled like that while playing piano. More photos showed his progression through childhood and adolescence. At age 10, serious and focused at his first competition. At 13, shaking hands with a judge after winning a regional contest. At 16, being accepted to the prestigious conservatory. In each successive photo, Victor noticed, he looked more accomplished and less happy. The joy visible in that early picture with his mother had been gradually replaced by intensity, ambition, and eventually a kind of polished professionalism that looked impressive but felt cold. Victor found a photo from his conservatory days that stopped him completely. He was 19, standing with a group of fellow students outside a practice room. They all looked exhausted but genuinely happy, arms around each other, probably celebrating the end of exams. Victor remembered that time. He remembered late nights in practice rooms, yes, but also gatherings in cheap apartments where they would drink wine and talk about music for hours. He remembered a girl named Katerina who played cello and laughed at his jokes. He remembered believing that music was the most important thing in the world, not because it would make him famous, but because it could express things that words could not. What had happened to that version of himself? Victor tried to trace the exact moment when everything changed, but there was no single moment. It had been gradual. The conservatory professor who told him he would never be great if he did not practice 8 hours a day. The competition where he came in second and felt the burning shame of not being the best. The first major concert where a critic praised his technique but called his interpretation cold. Each experience had taught him to practice more, perfect more, control more. Emotion became something to manage and deploy strategically rather than something to feel and express honestly. By the time he reached 30, Victor had become exactly what the classical music world wanted. A flawless performer who could execute the most difficult repertoire with machine-like precision. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped being a human being who played piano and became instead a piano-playing machine who happened to inhabit a human body. The distinction seemed small, but Victor was beginning to understand it was everything. Alina Kovac was a human being who played piano. Her technique was basic, her experience limited, but when she sat at that instrument she brought her whole self, her memories, her losses, her grandmother's voice, everything that made her human. Victor brought only his fingers and his training and his carefully cultivated performance persona. No wonder her simple folk song had moved people in ways his Rachmaninoff could not. Victor stood up abruptly, scattering photos across the floor. He walked to the music room and sat at the piano again. This time he did not try to play anything from his repertoire. Instead, he tried to remember songs from his childhood. His mother used to sing folk songs while doing housework, the same kinds of traditional melodies that Alina had played. Victor hummed one of them now, trying to recall the words. Something about a river and a lost love. He picked out the melody on the piano with one finger slowly like a child. It sounded thin and uncertain. He tried adding harmony with his left hand, but his trained instincts took over and he started making it too complicated, adding sophisticated chord progressions that did not fit the simple melody. He stopped and tried again, forcing himself to keep it simple, just the melody and basic accompaniment. It sounded plain and unsophisticated, nothing like the complex pieces he usually played. But as he continued, something small began to shift inside him. He thought about his mother singing this song. He thought about the apartment where he grew up, small and crowded but filled with warmth. He thought about learning piano not to become famous, but simply because his mother loved music and wanted to share that love with him. For the first time in weeks, Victor felt something other than confusion and emptiness. It was a small feeling, tentative and fragile, but it was real. He played the folk song 3 times through, and by the 3rd time, tears were running down his face. Victor could not remember the last time he had cried. Certainly not over music. Music was his job, his identity, his source of pride and validation. It was not supposed to make him cry like a child. But here he was, sitting at his expensive grand piano in his expensive estate, crying over a simple folk melody that his mother used to sing while washing dishes. Victor wiped his eyes and sat for a long time with his hands in his lap. The sun was setting over the lake, turning the water orange and gold. He thought about Alina Kovac going back to her hospital job, answering phones and managing schedules, probably trying to forget that night in Vienna ever happened. She had touched something essential about music in front of hundreds of people and then disappeared back into ordinary life as if it meant nothing. But it meant everything. Victor knew that now. The question was what he was supposed to do with this knowledge. He could not go back to performing the way he had before. That much was certain. The thought of stepping on stage and executing another technically perfect but emotionally empty concert made him feel physically ill. But what else could he do? His entire life had been built around being Victor Albrecht, the celebrated pianist. Without that identity, who was he? What did he have to offer the world? Victor spent the evening walking along the lake shore, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. He thought about his mother, dead now for 5 years. He thought about all the concerts she had attended, sitting in the audience with such pride on her face. Had she noticed what he had lost? Had she seen that her son had become technically brilliant but spiritually empty? Or had she just been proud that he had achieved success and recognition? He would never know. She had died suddenly of a heart attack, and their last conversation had been a brief phone call about scheduling, about which concerts she might attend that season. They had not talked about anything real or important in years. By the time Victor returned to the house, it was late and he was exhausted. But for the first time since the Vienna concert, he felt something like clarity beginning to emerge. He could not undo the past 3 decades. He could not go back and make different choices. But maybe he could go forward differently. Maybe it was not too late to rediscover what had drawn him to music in the first place. Maybe he could learn to be a human being who played piano instead of a piano-playing machine. And maybe, just maybe, the person who could help him understand how to do that was the hospital administrator who had accidentally shown him what he had lost. Victor pulled out his phone and opened the browser. It took him less than 10 minutes to find Alina Kovac's workplace. The hospital had a public directory. He stared at the address for a long time, his thumb hovering over the screen. What would he even say to her? How could he explain this crisis to someone he had mocked and humiliated? She probably hated him. She had every right to hate him. But Victor could not think of anyone else who might understand what he was struggling with. Everyone else in his professional world was invested in him returning to being the Victor Albrecht they knew. Only Alina had seen him in that moment when his carefully constructed persona cracked. When he stood on stage and realized that everything he had worked for meant less than a simple folk song played with honest emotion. He saved the hospital address in his phone and went to bed. Tomorrow he would decide whether he had the courage to actually go there. Tonight he just needed to sleep. 3 days later, Victor found himself sitting in the lobby of Vienna General Hospital, feeling more nervous than he had felt before any concert in his entire career. He had driven for 2 hours from the lake house, changed clothes 3 times in a hotel room, and then sat in his car in the hospital parking garage for another 30 minutes trying to convince himself that this was not completely insane. Now he was here, perched uncomfortably in a plastic chair near the information desk, waiting for Alina Kovac's shift to end. He had called the hospital that morning, pretending to be a family friend, and confirmed that Alina worked in cardiology administration and that her shift ended at 5 o'clock. It was 4:45 now. Victor had no plan beyond waiting for her to appear and somehow starting a conversation. He had not contacted her in advance because he was afraid she would refuse to see him. This way, at least he would have a chance to apologize in person before she could walk away. The lobby was busy with the usual hospital traffic. Visitors carrying flowers, medical staff in scrubs rushing past, patients moving slowly with IV poles. Victor felt completely out of place in his expensive cashmere sweater and designer jeans. He had tried to dress casually, but everything he owned looked expensive because it was expensive. Several people had glanced at him with recognition in their eyes, but so far no one had approached him. He kept his head down and pretended to read a newspaper he had grabbed from a side table. At 5 minutes past 5, Victor saw her. Alina emerged from a corridor marked administration, wearing dark pants and a simple blue blouse, a canvas bag over her shoulder, looking tired in the way people look at the end of a long workday. She was talking to a colleague, a younger woman who was laughing at something Alina had said. They walked toward the lobby exit together, and Victor stood up quickly, his newspaper falling to the floor. "Alina," he called out, his voice coming out louder than he intended. She stopped and turned, confusion on her face. It took her a moment to recognize him, and when she did, the color drained from her cheeks. Her colleague's eyes went wide. "Oh my God," the younger woman whispered, "that is Victor Albrecht." Alina stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, staring at him. Victor walked toward her, trying to smile but probably failing. "Alina, I'm sorry to surprise you like this. I was hoping we could talk for a moment." "Talk?" Alina found her voice, and it came out sharp with something between anger and disbelief. "You want to talk? Now here. I know this is unexpected. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but please, just a few minutes. I need to apologize to you properly, and I need to ask you something." Alina's colleague was practically vibrating with excitement. "Alina, oh my God, you have to talk to him. This is Victor Albrecht." Alina ignored her, keeping her eyes fixed on Victor. "You humiliated me in front of hundreds of people. You called me up on that stage as a joke. You thought it would be funny to watch me fail." "You are absolutely right," Victor said quietly. "Everything you just said is true. What I did was cruel and arrogant, and I am deeply sorry. I cannot undo it, but I want you to know that I have thought about that night every single day since it happened. Not because you humiliated me in return, though you had every right to, but because you showed me something I had forgotten. You reminded me what music is supposed to be." Alina stared at him for a long moment. Around them, hospital staff and visitors were starting to notice the conversation and slow down to watch. Someone was definitely recording on their phone. Alina glanced around, seeming to realize they were becoming a spectacle. "I cannot do this here," she said finally. "If you want to talk, there is a cafe 2 blocks from here. Blue awning, I will meet you there in 10 minutes. Victor nodded gratefully. "Thank you, I will be there." Alina turned to her colleague, who looked like she might explode from excitement. "Martina, not a word about this to anyone, I mean it." Then she walked quickly toward the exit without looking back. Victor found the cafe easily and took a table in the back corner. He ordered coffee he did not want and sat nervously tapping his fingers on the table. Maybe she would not come. Maybe she had just said that to get rid of him. But exactly 10 minutes later, Alina walked through the door. She had pulled her hair back in a ponytail and looked guarded and uncertain. She ordered tea at the counter and then came to sit across from Victor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victor studied her face, looking for something he could not name. She looked older than she had on stage, more worn down by life. There were lines around her eyes and a tiredness in her expression that came from years of routine work and modest expectations. But there was also something solid about her, something real and unperformative that Victor found himself drawn to. "I am sorry," he said again. "I know I already said that, but I want you to understand I mean it. What I did that night was unforgivable. I called you on stage because I thought it would be entertaining to watch someone with no training struggle in front of all those people. I thought it would make me look better by comparison. I was showing off and I was cruel and I have no excuse for it. Alina wrapped her hands around her teacup. Why did you come here? If you wanted to apologize, you could have sent a letter. Why show up at my workplace? Victor took a breath. Because I need your help and I could not ask for it in a letter. That night when you played your grandmother's folk song, something broke open inside me. I have spent 3 decades becoming the best technical pianist I could be, winning competitions, playing the most difficult repertoire, earning critical acclaim. But watching you, listening to you play that simple melody, I realized I had lost something essential. You were not performing, you were sharing something real and personal. The audience felt that. They responded to your honesty in a way they never respond to my technical perfection. And I realized I do not know how to do what you did. I have forgotten how to play music that matters. Alina looked at him skeptically. You are one of the most famous pianists in the world. You have played in every major concert hall. Critics call you a genius. What could you possibly need from me? Exactly what you had that night, Victor said. Whatever it was that let you sit at that piano and play something true, I have been trying to understand it for weeks. I have canceled all my performances. I cannot bring myself to go on stage and execute another technically perfect but emotionally dead concert. I need to learn how to play music the way you played it, like it matters, like it means something beyond just showing everyone how skilled I am. Alina shook her head slowly. I do not understand, I am not a teacher. I barely play piano. What I did that night was just remembering my grandmother. There was nothing special about it. That is where you are wrong, Victor said intently. What you did was everything. It was honest and vulnerable and real. You brought your whole self to that music. I have been trained to leave myself out of it, to be a perfect instrument for executing the composer's intentions. But what is the point of perfect execution if it does not touch anyone? You touched everyone in that hall with your imperfect, honest playing. I need to understand how to do that. Alina was quiet for a long moment, studying him. Victor could not read her expression. Finally, she said, you really have canceled all your performances. Everything for the next 3 months. My manager is threatening to drop me. Concert halls are threatening legal action. My career is probably over. That is insane. You are throwing away everything you worked for. No, Victor said, I am trying to figure out if there is anything worth keeping. Right now, I honestly do not know. Alina sipped her tea, thinking, what exactly do you want from me? I want you to teach me what you know, not about technique. I have more than enough technical training, but about the other part. About playing music that comes from somewhere real. About remembering why any of this matters. I cannot teach you that. I do not even know how I did it. I just sat down and thought about my grandmother and played a song I remembered. There is no method to it. Then maybe just talk to me, Victor said. Tell me about your grandmother. Tell me about those folk songs and where they came from. Tell me why music mattered to her. Maybe if I understand your story, I can start to find my own again. Alina looked at him for a long time and Victor saw something shift in her expression. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was recognition of something genuine in his desperation. This is very strange, she said finally. The famous pianist asking the hospital administrator to teach him about music. I know, but I do not know where else to turn. Alina sighed, I finish work at 5 every day. I cannot promise anything, but if you want to talk, we can talk. There is a practice room at the community center near where I live. It has an old piano. We could meet there sometimes if you want. Victor felt something loosen in his chest. Yes, thank you. I know this is an imposition, and I know I have no right to ask, but thank you. I am not doing this for you, Alina said. I am doing it because my grandmother believed music was too important to be left only to people like you. She believed it belonged to everyone, that it was a way of carrying forward the things that matter when everything else is taken away. If you have forgotten that, maybe you need to be reminded. But I warn you, if you are wasting my time or if this is some strange publicity stunt, I will walk away and you will never hear from me again. I understand this is not a publicity stunt. This is me trying to figure out if I can still be a musician, or if I have wasted my entire life becoming something else. Alina finished her tea and stood up. Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock. Community Center on Braytonseer Street. Do not be late. She left without saying goodbye, and Victor sat alone at the table feeling something he had not felt in years. It might have been hope. Victor arrived at the Braytonseer Street Community Center 15 minutes early on Tuesday evening, carrying a leather bag with sheet music he thought they might use. The building was old and slightly run down, the kind of place that served multiple purposes. Daycare in the mornings, senior activities in the afternoons, evening classes in various subjects. The practice room Alina had mentioned was on the second floor, small and plain with scuffed wooden floors and an upright piano that had seen better days. Victor tested a few keys and winced at the slightly out-of-tune sound. He was used to concert grands maintained by professional technicians. This instrument was serviceable at best. Alina arrived exactly at 7, still in her work clothes, looking tired and slightly wary. "You came," she said, as if she had half expected him not to show up. "I told you I would." Famous people say many things. Following through is different. She set down her bag and looked at the piano. "This is not what you are used to." "No," Victor admitted. "But maybe that is good. Maybe I need to remember that music does not require a perfect instrument in a perfect concert hall." They sat at the piano bench together, an awkward proximity that made both of them self-conscious. Victor suggested they start by playing something simple together, but Alina shook her head. "No, if we are doing this, we do it my way. You said you wanted to understand where music came from for my grandmother, so I am going to tell you her story first. Then maybe you will understand why that folk song mattered." Victor settled back to listen, and Alina began to talk. Her grandmother had been born in a small village in what was now part of Slovakia, but had changed hands between different countries multiple times through wars and political upheavals. She had been trained as a music teacher and taught piano and singing to children in the village school. When the war came, everything was destroyed. Her husband was killed. Her home was burned. She fled with her young daughter, Alina's mother, carrying almost nothing. But she carried the songs, the folk melodies that had been passed down through generations. Those songs were all that remained of the village and the life she had known. "She came to Vienna with nothing," Alina said quietly. "No money, no possessions, no family except my mother. She worked as a cleaning woman in hotels. But in the evenings, she would teach piano to neighborhood children for whatever their families could afford to pay. Sometimes they paid with food instead of money. She taught my mother, and later she taught me. The folk songs were important to her because they were proof that something had survived. All those people from her village were dead or scattered, but the melodies remained. When she played those songs, she was keeping those people alive in some way." Victor listened in silence, moved by the weight of loss in Alina's story. His own path to music had been so different. His mother had been a bank clerk who loved music as a hobby. She had paid for his lessons as a child because he showed talent, and his teachers had encouraged him to pursue it seriously. There had been no tragedy in his story, no loss, just steady advancement based on ability and hard work. He had never had to think about music as survival or memory or resistance against forgetting. "My grandmother died when I was 12, Alina continued. "She had a stroke and was gone within a day. I was devastated. She had been teaching me piano for 4 years and I loved our lessons. But after she died, I could not bring myself to play anymore. It hurt too much. The piano reminded me of her and I was not ready to deal with that grief, so I just stopped. For 26 years, I barely touched a piano. And then that night at the concert, when you called me up as a joke, I was terrified and humiliated. But when I sat at that piano, I suddenly heard her voice in my head. I could feel her hands guiding mine the way she used to when I was learning. And I played that folk song because it was hers, and I wanted to show everyone what real music sounded like, even if I could only play it badly." "You did not play it badly," Victor said softly. "You played it honestly. There is a difference." They sat in silence for a moment, then Alina turned to him. "Now you tell me your story. Why did you start playing piano?" Victor had never been asked that question in exactly that way before. Interviewers always asked when he started, or who his teachers were, or what competitions he had won. But no one asked why. He thought about it carefully before answering. "I do not think I had a profound reason. I was 7 years old. My mother took me to a concert, some student recital at the local music school. I was amazed that someone could make those sounds come out of that instrument. It seemed like magic, so I asked if I could learn. My mother was surprised but pleased. She arranged lessons with a teacher in our neighborhood. I liked it immediately. I liked the feeling of mastering something difficult, of seeing myself improve week by week. My teacher noticed I had talent and pushed me to enter competitions. I kept winning. Each success led to the next opportunity. Better teachers, better schools, eventually the conservatory. It all seemed to happen naturally, like I was on a path that had been laid out for me." "When did you stop enjoying it?" Alina asked. The question caught Victor off guard. "I'm not sure I ever stopped enjoying it exactly. It was more like the enjoyment changed into something else. By the time I was at the conservatory, music was not about joy anymore. It was about perfection, about being the best, about building a career. The stakes felt so high all the time. Every performance was being judged. Every mistake could damage my reputation. I learned to manage my emotions very carefully, to never let nerves or excitement or sadness affect my playing. I learned to be consistent and reliable and technically flawless. But I think in the process I learned to feel nothing at all when I played. It became mechanical. That sounds lonely, Alina said. It became mechanical. That sounds lonely, Alina said. I suppose it was, Victor admitted. But I did not think about it that way. I was successful, I was respected. I told myself that was enough. Was it? No, clearly it was not, or I would not be here. They sat together at the old upright piano, two people from completely different worlds, brought together by one strange night and a shared sense that something essential about music had been lost and might possibly be found again. Alina opened the piano lid and played a few notes, testing the sound. Then she began to play the folk melody from that night in Vienna. It sounded different on this imperfect instrument in this plain room, more intimate and personal. Victor listened, and this time he heard not just the melody but the story behind it. The village that no longer existed, the grandmother who had survived everything, the songs that carried memory forward when memory was all that remained. When Alina finished, she looked at Victor. Now you play something, but not from your repertoire, play something from your childhood, something you learned before competitions and careers and critics. Something that mattered to you before you learned to perform. Victor thought for a moment, then began to play a simple piece by Schumann, one of the Kinderscenen. He had learned it when he was 9 years old and his mother had loved it. He had not played it in probably 25 years. His fingers stumbled at first, searching for notes he had not accessed in decades, but gradually the piece came back to him. It was far simpler than anything he performed in concerts, just a small character piece meant to evoke childhood scenes. But playing it now, he remembered being 9 years old in his mother's apartment, playing this for her while she sat on the couch with her tea, smiling at him with such uncomplicated pride and love. He felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When he finished the piece, his hands were shaking slightly. Alina did not say anything, just placed her hand briefly on his shoulder in a gesture of understanding. They sat in silence for a long moment. That was real, she said finally. Whatever you just felt while playing that is what needs to be in your music. But how do I do that with Rachmaninoff or Liszt? How do I bring that kind of honesty to pieces that are meant to be grand and virtuosic? I do not know, Alina said. But maybe you need to stop thinking about what the pieces are meant to be and start thinking about what they mean to you. Why do you play Rachmaninoff? What is it about that music that matters to you, if anything? If the answer is just that it is impressive and difficult and looks good on a program, maybe you should not be playing it at all. Victor absorbed this, knowing she was right but not sure how to bridge the gap between understanding the problem and solving it. They spent the next hour playing together, taking turns at the piano. Alina taught him 2 more folk songs her grandmother had taught her. Victor shared pieces from his childhood repertoire. They talked about their families, their losses, the moments when music had mattered most to them. It was not like any music lesson Victor had ever experienced. There was no discussion of technique or interpretation or historical context. It was just 2 people sharing what music meant to them personally, honestly. When they finally left the community center at 9 o'clock, Victor felt exhausted but also more alive than he had felt in months. They arranged to meet again on Thursday evening. This became their pattern over the following weeks. Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the practice room with the out-of-tune upright piano. No publicity, no managers, no professional pressure. Just talking and playing and slowly, carefully, trying to find their way back to something essential that had been buried under years of professionalism and technical perfection. Victor's manager called repeatedly, increasingly frantic about the concerts that remained cancelled, the income being lost, the reputation being damaged. Victor listened to the voicemails but rarely called back. The classical music press ran articles speculating about his sudden disappearance from the concert circuit. Some suggested health problems, others whispered about mental breakdown or scandal. A few astute observers noticed that Victor Albrecht had been spotted in Vienna, that there might be some connection to the viral video from the concert gala, but most dismissed this as coincidental. Alina's life was also becoming more complicated. Her coworkers could not stop asking about Victor. Was she teaching him? Were they dating? How did this happen? Alina deflected the questions as best she could, but the constant attention at work was exhausting. She had never wanted any kind of spotlight, and now she felt like her quiet life was being slowly invaded by curiosity and gossip. Despite these pressures, their meetings continued. Week by week, something was shifting in Victor. He was beginning to remember what it felt like to play piano as a human being rather than as a performing machine. Alina was changing too, rediscovering skills and confidence she had lost when she stopped playing after her grandmother's death. They were helping each other find their way back to music, though neither of them was sure where this journey would ultimately lead. All they knew was that these evenings in the community center practice room felt more important and real than anything either of them had experienced in years. 6 weeks into their informal lessons, Victor arrived at the community center with an unexpected proposal. Alina was already at the piano, playing through a Chopin prelude Victor had suggested she learn. Her technique was improving steadily, though she still approached the piano with more heart than precision. She looked up when Victor entered, noticing immediately that something was different about his expression. He looked nervous but also energized in a way she had not seen before. "I have been thinking about something," he said, setting down his bag. "I want to do a concert, a real performance, but not the kind I used to do. Something completely different." Alina stopped playing. "What do you mean?" "I want to perform a benefit concert for the hospital where you work. A fundraiser for the cardiology department, and I want you to perform with me. As equals sharing the stage." Alina's face went pale. "Victor, no, that is insane. I cannot perform with you. I am not a concert pianist. I have been playing seriously again for less than 2 months. I would humiliate myself." "Well, you would not. You would be exactly what you were that night in Vienna, honest and real. That is what people need to hear." "That was a fluke. I was terrified and not thinking clearly. I cannot recreate that on purpose in front of an audience. Especially not alongside you. The comparison would be humiliating." Victor sat beside her on the bench. "Listen to me. I have spent the past 6 weeks learning from you, learning how to bring myself back into my music. Learning that technical perfection means nothing if the music does not come from somewhere real. Now I want to share what we have been doing. I want to show people that music belongs to everyone, not just to trained professionals. That sometimes an amateur playing with honest emotion can move people more than a virtuoso executing difficult passages perfectly. Your manager would never allow it, the concert halls would never book it. And your reputation would be destroyed. Playing alongside someone like me makes you look bad. My manager is already furious with me, my reputation is already damaged, and I do not care anymore. I am tired of protecting an image that has nothing to do with why I fell in love with music in the first place. This concert would be for the right reasons. Raising money for a good cause, yes, but more than that. Showing people what music can be when it is done honestly." Alina shook her head, fear evident on her face. "I cannot do it, Victor. I am sorry, but you are asking too much. That night in Vienna was terrifying, and the only reason I survived it was because I was not prepared. If I had time to think about it beforehand, I would never have been able to play a single note. Knowing in advance that I was going to perform alongside you in front of hundreds of people, I would panic, I would freeze, it would be a disaster." Victor was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he said, "What if we structured it differently? Not as a traditional concert where we take turns performing solo pieces. Instead, we program it as a conversation through music. We talk between pieces, explaining where the music comes from and what it means. We tell your grandmother's story. We play the folk songs and explain their history. We play some classical pieces but frame them in a personal context, make it less about performance and more about sharing something meaningful." Alina looked uncertain. "That still sounds terrifying." "I know, but think about what your grandmother would say. She believed music was too important to be left only to professionals. She taught children in her village, she taught while working as a cleaning woman in Vienna. She passed these songs to you because she believed they needed to survive. Would she not want you to share them with more people? Would she not be proud that you had this opportunity?" Alina felt tears forming in her eyes. "That is not fair, using my grandmother to manipulate me. I am not manipulating you, I am reminding you of what you told me. That music was about keeping people alive in memory, about passing forward what matters. You have the chance to do that now in a bigger way. Yes, it will be frightening. Yes, you will be criticized by people who think you do not belong on a concert stage. But you will also touch people the way you touched that audience in Vienna. And maybe you will inspire someone else to rediscover music in their own life." They sat in silence. Alina looked at her hands, thinking about her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and gentle, guiding her fingers across the keys. She thought about the night at the Vienna concert hall, the terror, and then the strange sense of connection she had felt with the audience. She thought about these past weeks with Victor, watching him slowly rediscover his own love for music. Could she really do this? Could she stand on a stage deliberately, knowing in advance what she was getting into? "If I say yes," she said slowly, "and I am not saying yes yet, but if I did, there would have to be conditions. This could not be a publicity stunt. It would have to genuinely raise money for the hospital. And you would have to accept that I might fail. I might freeze on stage or play terribly. You would have to be prepared for that. I accept those conditions, but I do not believe you will fail." "When would this concert be?" "Well, it's 3 months from now. That gives us time to prepare properly, to choose the right music and practice together and get comfortable with the format." 3 months, that is not very long. "It is enough time. We are not preparing a virtuoso showcase. We are preparing something honest. That does not require years of practice, it just requires courage. Alina closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to say no. But there was another part, smaller and quieter, that sounded suspiciously like her grandmother's voice, telling her that opportunities like this did not come twice. "All right," she said, finally opening her eyes. "I will do it, but I am going to regret this decision, I can already tell." Victor smiled genuinely and openly in a way Alina had rarely seen from him. "You will not regret it. I promise." He was wrong about that. Over the next 3 months, Alina regretted her decision approximately 3 times per day. Victor arranged everything with frightening efficiency. His manager was horrified by the concept and refused to be involved, so Victor contacted the concert venue directly. He chose a mid-sized hall in Vienna, not as prestigious as where the gala had been held but still significant. The hospital administration was thrilled about the fundraiser and provided extensive support. Tickets went on sale and sold out within hours, driven partly by curiosity about Victor's return to performing and partly by people who remembered the viral video and wanted to see what would happen. The program they designed was unconventional. It mixed classical pieces with folk songs, solo performances with duets, and included segments where they would talk to the audience about music and memory and loss. Victor would open with a Chopin nocturne played the traditional way, demonstrating his technical skill. Then Alina would play one of her grandmother's folk songs. They would talk about the contrast between trained and untrained playing, about what music meant in different contexts. Victor would play the same Schumann piece he had played in the community center, but this time he would speak first about his mother and what that piece meant to him personally. Alina would share her grandmother's story. In the second half, they would play duets and take questions from the audience. The finale would be a joint performance of the folk song Alina had played that first night, but this time with Victor accompanying her, supporting rather than competing. As the concert date approached, Alina's panic intensified. She practiced obsessively, trying to prepare for every possible thing that could go wrong. She barely slept the week before the performance. Her co-workers at the hospital kept offering encouragement that only made her more nervous. Victor remained calm and supportive, but Alina could tell he was nervous too, though for different reasons. This concert would define whether his experiment in honesty and vulnerability had any place in the professional classical music world. If it failed, he would be confirming what his critics said, that he had lost his mind and destroyed a brilliant career over nothing. The night of the concert arrived. Alina stood backstage in a simple dark blue dress, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her program. Victor stood beside her in a black suit, looking surprisingly peaceful. "We have prepared as much as we can," he said quietly. "Now we just need to trust that what we have to share matters. Remember why we are doing this." "I am terrified," Alina whispered. "I know, so am I, but we are terrified together and that helps." The stage manager signaled it was time. Victor walked out first to thunderous applause. Alina heard him speak briefly to the audience, explaining the unusual format of the evening and introducing the concept. Then he called her name, and she forced her legs to carry her onto the stage. The applause was encouraging, but she could barely hear it over the sound of her own heartbeat. She took her place on the stage, and the concert began. The first 20 minutes were a blur of terror. Alina played her folk song competently, but could tell her nervousness was affecting the music. Victor's Chopin was beautiful, but when he spoke afterward about his mother, his voice cracked slightly with emotion in a way that never happened in traditional performances. The audience seemed confused at first, not sure what to make of this format, but gradually something shifted. When Victor played the Schumann and spoke about childhood and what had been lost, people began to lean forward in their seats. When Alina told her grandmother's story, several people in the audience were visibly moved. By the second half, both performers had found their rhythm. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. Alina realized that the audience was not judging them harshly. They were listening with genuine interest and empathy. When Victor and Alina played a duet together, a simple folk melody arranged for 4 hands, the interaction between them on stage felt natural and warm. When they took questions from the audience, one elderly woman stood and thanked them tearfully, saying the concert had reminded her of her own mother who used to sing folk songs, and that she had not thought about those memories in years. Other people shared similar stories. The concert hall had transformed from a venue for performance into a space for shared memory and emotion. The finale brought everything together. Alina played her grandmother's folk song, and Victor accompanied with gentle harmonies that supported rather than overshadowed. When they finished, the silence lasted several seconds before the applause began. Then the entire audience rose to their feet, and the ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. People were crying openly. Alina and Victor stood side by side, holding hands, both of them overwhelmed by what they had created together. 6 months after the benefit concert, Alina sat in her grandmother's old apartment, which had remained in the family all these years. Her mother had kept it as a rental property, but it was between tenants now. Alina had asked if she could spend an afternoon there alone, and her mother had agreed without asking why. Alina walked through the small rooms, remembering the kitchen where her grandmother had made tea and told stories. The living room where the upright piano had once stood, now long gone. The window with lace curtains where afternoon sunlight used to stream through. She sat on the floor by that window and pulled out her phone. The video of the benefit concert was still available online, professionally recorded and posted by the hospital for fundraising purposes. Alina had watched it only once, immediately after the performance, unable to tolerate her own image on screen. But now, 6 months later, she felt ready to look at it again. She pressed play and watched herself and Victor walk onto that stage. She saw her own fear clearly visible on her face. She heard the nervousness in her playing during the first folk song. But she also saw what happened as the evening progressed, the way both of them relaxed into honesty, the way the audience responded with increasing warmth and engagement. The concert had raised over €200,000 for the hospital cardiology department. But more than the money, it had started something neither Alina nor Victor had anticipated. In the weeks after the performance, they had been contacted by dozens of people wanting to share their own stories about music and memory and loss. Community centers had asked them to do similar events. Music teachers had written to say the concert had reminded them why they taught. Amateur musicians had reached out to say they had stopped playing years ago but were inspired to start again. Victor's career had transformed completely. He had not returned to the traditional concert circuit and probably never would. His manager had dropped him, as threatened, and most of the prestigious concert halls were no longer interested in booking him. But Victor had discovered he did not want those things anymore. Instead, he had founded a music program that brought classical training to ordinary people, not just talented children being groomed for professional careers. He performed in smaller venues now, community spaces and schools, always trying to create that sense of connection and honesty that had happened at the benefit concert. Critics were divided. Some called his new direction a waste of his talent. Others praised his courage in abandoning ego for authenticity. Victor cared less about critical opinion than he ever had before. Alina had continued working at the hospital, but had also started teaching piano in the evenings, just as her grandmother once had. She taught in the same community center where she and Victor had practiced together. Her students were mostly adults who had always wanted to learn or who had played as children and wanted to return to it. Alina taught them folk songs alongside classical pieces, and she always emphasized that music was not about perfection, but about expression and memory and keeping important things alive. She and Victor had remained close friends. They still met to play together every week, sometimes at the community center, sometimes at Victor's lake house. Their friendship had been scrutinized by the media and gossiped about by people who assumed it must be romantic, but it was actually something deeper and more unusual. They had saved each other in different ways. Victor had given Alina a reason to reconnect with music and honor her grandmother's legacy. Alina had given Victor permission to be human again, to value honesty over perfection, to remember why music had mattered to him before it became a career. Alina scrolled through the video to the final performance, where she and Victor played the folk song together. She watched the way he looked at her as they played, encouraging and supportive. She watched her own fingers on the keys, still imperfect in technique but confident in purpose. She heard her grandmother's melody filling the concert hall, simple and true, carrying forward the memory of people and places that no longer existed except in song. After watching, Alina opened a voice memo app on her phone. She recorded herself playing the folk song on the upright piano that Victor had recently purchased for her and had delivered to her apartment, a beautiful gift that had made her cry. When she finished, she uploaded the recording to the digital memorial page she had created for her grandmother. It was a small website where she collected stories and songs from her grandmother's village, trying to preserve what little remained. The site had grown over the months as distant relatives and researchers had found it and contributed their own memories and songs. Her grandmother's voice was not on any recording, would never be heard again except in Alina's memory. But the songs could continue. The melodies could carry forward. Alina sat by the window a while longer, watching the afternoon light shift across the floor. She thought about that night at the Vienna concert hall, how terrified and humiliated she had felt when Victor called her onto the stage. She thought about how that single moment had led to everything that came after. The viral video, Victor appearing at the hospital, their months of practice together, the benefit concert, the new directions both their lives had taken. If someone had told her a year ago that she would be performing on concert stages and teaching piano and building a friendship with one of the world's most famous pianists, she would have laughed in disbelief. But here she was. Life had become larger and stranger and more meaningful than she could have predicted. And it had all started because she had found the courage to play one simple song honestly, to share something true in a moment when everyone expected her to fail. Her grandmother had been right. Music was about survival, about resistance against forgetting, about passing forward what mattered. Alina had almost let it die with her grief when she was 12 years old. But now, 26 years later, she was carrying it forward again, teaching new people the old songs, keeping her grandmother's voice alive in the melodies that persisted. Alina stood and walked through the apartment one more time before leaving. At the door, she paused and spoke aloud to the empty rooms. "Thank you, grandmother, for the songs, for the lessons. For believing music was important enough to survive everything. I am trying to honor that. I hope I am making you proud." The apartment was silent, but Alina felt certain her grandmother heard somehow. She locked the door and walked out into the Vienna afternoon, thinking about her evening piano class and the new students who would arrive at the community center in a few hours. Ordinary people with ordinary lives who deserved to know that music belonged to them too, that they did not need to be virtuosos or professionals to find meaning and beauty in playing. This was her grandmother's legacy, passed through Alina now to others. A chain of ordinary people keeping extraordinary things alive through simple melodies and honest expression. Across the city, Victor was in his practice room at the lake house, working on a new program for a series of community performances he had scheduled. He was learning folk songs from different traditions, expanding beyond the ones Alina had taught him. He was also rearranging some classical pieces, making them more accessible and emotionally direct. His playing had changed dramatically in the past 6 months. It was less technically flashy but far more communicative. He would never be the same pianist he had been before that night in Vienna. But he was becoming something better. A musician who understood that the point of music was not to impress people with your skill, but to connect with them through shared emotion and experience. He thought about Alina often, grateful for what she had taught him without even trying to teach. She had simply been herself, had played honestly, and had shown him what he had lost. Victor would spend the rest of his career trying to reclaim that honesty and share it with others. It would never earn him the same kind of critical acclaim he had once enjoyed. But it would matter more. It would mean something real. The sun was setting over the lake, turning the water gold and orange. Victor sat at his piano and played the folk song that had changed everything, the melody Alina had played that first night. He played it softly for himself, remembering. Then he began to improvise on the theme, exploring different harmonies and variations. The music floated out through the open windows and across the water, simple and true, a celebration of what had been found after so much had been lost. Two people from different worlds had taught each other how to remember what mattered. And now they were both trying to pass that lesson forward, one note at a time, one student at a time, one honest performance at a time. The work would continue, the songs would survive, and somewhere in memory and melody, Alina's grandmother was smiling.